Welcome to Podclassed with Laura Axtell, a seasoned educator of 26 years. In each episode of Podclassed, Laura explores a current educational topic from a variety of perspectives to identify practical solutions to help improve the future of education. Podclassed is brought to you by Reading Horizons, the creator of a data-driven literacy program for beginning readers, struggling readers, and English language learners of all ages. Visit readinghorizons.com to learn more. And now, Podclassed with your host, Laura Axtell.
Welcome to Podclassed, and thanks for joining us. One of the benefits of hosting a podcast is that I have the opportunity to explore a range of topics and hear from so many amazing educators, parents, and experts about those topics. Today's episode will be different from any of the podcasts we've done on Podclassed, however. There won't be any experts, and the topic may be a new one for many of you. This episode and the next one, part 2, will share the stories of 4 people with a common theme: the trauma that comes from the shame and anxiety of having undiagnosed dyslexia. While some research exists on the long-term educational and vocational effects of learning difficulties, almost no research has been done on the emotional impact. Today you'll hear first from Greg, who is now a successful school administrator and author, and then Lindsay, the mother of a child with dyslexia. As they describe their experiences, listen for the emotions they express. We'll start with Greg's story.
So I'm Greg Walcott, Assistant Superintendent for Teaching and Learning in Woodridge School District 68 outside of Chicago. I'm a professional development consultant with First Resources and author of the book Significant 72: Power of Relationships. My earliest memories of school really start in kindergarten. And in kindergarten, I knew that I couldn't stay focused as long as other kids, and I couldn't stay on task, concentrating on the different reading things that the teachers needed me to focus on. And I remember vividly the teacher saying, "Okay, Greg, you got to get your break now." And she'd open up the back door, and I'd go out to the merry-go-round, and I would go out and do some spins, and she'd give me about 5 minutes out there, and then I'd come back in, and she helped me, and she kind of saw how I learned a little bit differently. Luckily at that point I had a teacher that kind of saw that what my needs were, and then kind of modified and differentiated for me. Unfortunately, as I got older, it wasn't as powerful, or and the teachers were very different. And so, I vividly remember in 3rd grade being, as the reading groups broke up and we went into different reading groups, and I was the only blackbird. And we literally had, the bluebirds, the cardinals, and all the different groups, and then me. And I was I was a blackbird, and the teacher would put me in that group, and I was kind of stuck on SRA cards. And SRA cards were these cards that just had comprehension question after comprehension question. And you would then go to this filing system and check your answers. And that's, really how, kind of the feeling of being a reader that unfortunately took hold in my head, was that's all I could do. And that I really, I couldn't read well enough to actually be in a group. I was kind of stuck on my own, and that kind of just, eats at you a little bit. So then, into 5th grade, and I had a math teacher and got my first D on a math test. And I was so disappointed when she handed it back. And I said, what is this? And she said, well, you're not a good reader either. Why did you think you'd be good in math? And, those things, whatever caused her to say that, those messages, ring true in her head. And so that concept of not being a good reader and not being good at math and the blackbird issue, it just kind of sticks with you. And so as I moved into junior high, same types of things. Luckily, I had, kind of sports as an outlet, so I kind of could start developing something else as an identity. But I suffered from that. Every time there were reading activities, I would basically do whatever I had to do not to read in class, or not to be in any situation where that reading might, make me look different than everyone else. And, when papers were turned back, I'd throw them down right away so nobody could see them. And, social studies, I remember, was still in those days a lot of, reading from the chapter. And I would sit there and I don't know why my teachers did it, but you kind of could count out paragraph by paragraph when it was going to be your turn. And I'd count out, and I'd know my paragraph, and I would read that paragraph 5-6 times. I didn't pay attention to anything going on before me, but I'd reread that paragraph 5 or 6 times in hopes that when it finally was my turn, and then, you hear every snicker and you hear every noise that everyone else, when it is your turn to read, you feel that shame. And so and that lack of self-confidence. So now at that point, you're just focused, or at least I was focused on what everyone else in the room, how they're reacting to my reading was, rather than, because I was just so self-conscious about the situation. There were classes, specifically the social studies, I remember, where the teacher, that was part of his routine, that it was stressful every day to go to that class, because I knew that when I got there, it was going to be, reading time. And, and the other aspect of the reading was then not just the reading aloud, but in areas like that, if it wasn't if it was a topic that I loved, I was all in on that period of time, for example, in history, and I would shine. But if I didn't have as much background knowledge about that, boy, was it tough. And so as I struggled, I saw everyone around me being successful. I saw my brothers on the honor roll. I saw those things. And so I just began to think, I'm not able. I'm not smart enough to do it. And I thought, okay, at least I have, sports to turn to. Some kids didn't even have that, but it was okay. I just can't. I can't do this, and so it just really gets you questioning about yourself. And so that I kind of struggled with that until luckily I had a coach that really believed in me and said some powerful things to me, and really got me to believe that I was pretty powerful and that I could do things. And I started to feel my way into different things, and because I was finally able to really chase things that were passionate to me, I could overcome some of my reading struggles. So in college, then I chose elementary education. My dad had been an elementary school principal, and I saw, the impact he was having, and I saw my love for kids, and that passion kind of took over. And so as I worked through college and got into the elementary education programs, I knew then that that's exactly what I wanted to do. I started feeling more success. Student teaching then took off, and it was great. But feeling that passion, that purpose, it really propelled me into student teaching. Still struggled, but I knew what I was like and what I could do when I was with kids. I still remember standing up in front of the class and doing a spelling activity and saying herbs instead of herbs. In front of 5th graders, and my cooperating teacher, having to pull me aside afterward and saying, Herbie, and she would tease me about that, but again, in the stress of the moment, I was reading the word, not really understanding the word as I read it. And so then as I got through student teaching and made it through student teaching, started entering the classroom and began teaching right away, 3rd grade. And the 1st grade teacher came down, and I was very nervous. And I didn't want to teach older kids on purpose because I didn't have the self-confidence to teach older kids. So I started out teaching in 3rd grade, and luckily the 1st grade teacher came down and he said, look, I'm a big believer in teaching phonics and very systematic phonics. And he said, I've been using this program. And he said, there are kids that moved in between when I had them in 1st grade and when you had it in 3rd grade. And he said, so you've got to teach them. And I was like, oh, wow, I can't. I'm trying to say, I'm thinking to myself, I have struggles myself reading. That's why I'm teaching 3rd grade and not older kids. And he said, come to my workshop on Saturday morning. And so that Saturday morning, he did a workshop on the program, taught me all the rules, taught me the sounds, taught me everything. And that became then the core of my instruction at 3rd grade. And I think there's a quote, to teach is to learn twice. And that's probably the best quote ever for me when it came to learning to read, because once that happened, it really propelled me. It was amazing teaching it to kids, obviously seeing their success, but my own success. And I went from somebody who maybe other than assignments, I don't know if I ever read a full non-picture book through college, to the point now I probably read 4 or 5 books a month. But if it wasn't for the fact that I had to go through the program to teach it to the kids, then, and learn how to truly read myself. Because of dyslexia, I continue to develop other strengths. And I think one of those was to be more curious and constantly being curious and seeking out information in different areas. And from that forced me to really, build other skills such as, the ability to relate well with others and to take connections to a little different level. And it allowed me to really see, because I had all those personal experiences of being vulnerable, it made me realize how incredibly important it is in our classrooms, that every kid has that opportunity to feel vulnerable, and that can't happen unless it's truly a safe environment. And, and from there I realized, and the crux of my teaching is that every, as I say in the book, every student has a story. They have their strengths, their tendencies, their opportunities, their resources, and their yearnings. And for us to teach them well, we have to know them well. And if we don't know their story, we're not going to be the successful educators we need to be, so that they can be prepared for the future. And I know that many of my teachers didn't get to know my story. Had they'd have seen the struggles I was having with reading and the shame and guilt I felt about my abilities, and they would have looked at it that differently. There are other strengths I have that I could have used to get over that hurdle. And too many of them looked at it as, this is just, a life sentence, instead of just, hey, no, this is an opportunity.
We'll be right back.
Podclassed is sponsored by Reading Horizons, the creator of a data-driven literacy program for beginning readers, struggling readers, and English language learners of all ages. With data-informing software and teacher-led instruction, students receive targeted intervention that leads to rapid reading improvement. Visit readinghorizons.com/trial for 14 days of free access to our software.
Thank you, Greg, for the courage to share your story. As you listened, did you notice that Greg was able to recall in vivid detail the fear and embarrassment he felt around reading, even as a very young child? There is a great deal of evidence that prolonged exposure to events that elicit fear, helplessness, and shame may result in trauma. In fact, a 2016 research article in the Journal of Clinical Medicine is titled Ashamed and Afraid, a scoping review of the role of shame in post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. While we often think of trauma and PTSD as a result of military service or abuse, many older students and adults explain their school experiences as young children in much the same way. In the next episode, you'll hear an adult describe his school experience and that of his son as brutal. Is it possible then that undiagnosed dyslexia and other learning issues could be contributing to some of the emotional factors we are seeing so frequently in our students? Anxiety, depression, and behavior problems? Now we'll listen to Lindsay's journey as a parent. Although she has a degree in elementary education, Lindsay felt unprepared for the challenges she faced with her son's language and reading difficulties.
When I got to my second oldest child, things completely fell apart. And his name is Rave, and he's 12 now. But I noticed in the very beginning he was a late speaker. So when he was 2 years old, the benchmark that your pediatrician gives you is they should have 2-word sentences. And he barely had a vocabulary of maybe 15 words, period. And even those words weren't pronounced very well. He was deleting sounds or substituting sounds, or it was more babbling than actual speech. And so we intervened before he was 3 years old. I got him in speech pathology through our local district, and we started doing a mom and me talking time with some licensed speech pathologists. And that helped a lot. And we spent 2 years in there, and he was able to learn to make all those sounds. And that was the first time after 2 full years in speech pathology that he started to interact with other kids outside our family, cousins and siblings and such, because he was so embarrassed, even at a tiny age, that he couldn't speak very well and that people couldn't understand him. So kindergarten started okay, and Ray was a great memorizer, so I didn't pick up in kindergarten that he wasn't learning to read, because he was smart enough and he had the skills enough and the intelligence enough to memorize if he heard a book read to him once. And I would do that as a skill. I'd read it to him once and then let them read it back to me when I was teaching my kids to read, and he could memorize it and tell it back well enough that if he missed a word or two, I just thought, oh, he's missing a word or two. But it wasn't until first grade that I really realized that something was off. And I would spend time reading with him, and he couldn't follow the lines. Once it was more than one line on a page, he would skip lines or he would skip words. He couldn't keep his place. And I was probably the meanest mom because I felt like he just wasn't trying hard enough or focusing hard enough to follow along, or his pencil to follow where we are at. He could not do it. And I would get so frustrated with him, and I try and be loving. I was trying to not to make reading be a punishment, but to be this positive experience. And then he could never, ever, ever get down sight words. Words that just don't have a concrete picture to go with them, like apple, he could not keep in his head. So they, the, those, these, words like that, he would always substitute with another one. He could get something about, but he could never get the right word. And this was becoming more and more pronounced and more worrisome for me. And by second grade, I knew he needed help more than what I could offer him. And so I started looking everywhere for something more. I was talking to teachers. I was trying to get help from the school, from the principal. I was looking online, and that was the first time I put him in a reading camp. Doctorate students would come on these reading camps, and I'd send him there, and they would always tell me how amazing his comprehension was, but that he just wasn't getting the basics. But then they didn't have any tools for me to tell me what the basics were. And I just felt like everyone knew what the problem was, that he just needed the basics and the rules, but no one could tell me what those were. And I was scrambling to find anything I could because I couldn't remember being taught what the basics were. I didn't know what the rules were. I didn't know why sometimes C made the cuh sound and sometimes it made S's sound. And I was trying to figure out where we were supposed to be taught all these, or when I learned them, or where I could find them. And I wasn't finding it. So we bought into, my husband and I, this extremely expensive program that we found online. And it was what a bunch of other schools have bought into for struggling readers. And it was supposed to help pattern the brain and help with memory. And they claimed to help dyslexic students, which I was feeling like Ray was dyslexic at this point in time. And so it was actually $2,000 for every 3 months. And so we paid for 6 months of it. And he did 45 minutes a day, 5 days a week. And they'd have a speech pathologist call us with his results at the end of each week and tell us what to work on. And it was very basic things like difference in pitch and sound. And it had like memory programs like move the triangle to the circle or put the square next to the red star. And it didn't seem in my head like that would connect to his reading, but I was willing to try anything. And I don't think it was hurtful for him, but we didn't see any improvement in his reading in those 6 months. And it was too expensive to just keep going on doing that if we weren't seeing improvement. He, at that point, had been pulled out of class and put into resource, and we weren't getting anywhere there. And I know that classes are overcrowded, and there's not funding to do all that they want to do. But Rave was just falling further and further behind in school, and school is so language-based. So even though Rafe's primary struggle was with his reading, spelling, and writing, he was missing and falling behind in everything else, like his math and his science, because it's language-based. He couldn't read the problem and understand it enough to do it. But if I read him the problem, he knew exactly what to do. But sadly for Rave, he missed an entire year of math instruction being pulled out into special education, into his resource class, because he couldn't read the text. And so after missing a year of it, but working with him at home and seeing that he understood the concepts, and had to move back into his regular classroom where he holds great grades as long as he has someone to help read the question for him. And he's even got to the point now where he can read it himself. But it was such a struggle and so heartbreaking as a mother to see that he was starting to fall behind and hate everything about life and not associate with friends and be terrified to go to school and be sick about it. Because if he was asked to read, he didn't want to sound like an idiot or like he couldn't do it or like he didn't measure up. And he even had a couple teachers who just treated him like, you know what, it's not going to get better than this. You know, he just struggles. And they didn't believe in him. And kids pick up on those cues. And it was awful as a parent.
Thank you, Lindsay, for providing a parent's perspective. I would like to invite you back for the next episode, part 2 on this topic. We'll hear from 2 adults who also share a bit about their family histories with dyslexia and the very real difficulties they encountered in school, as well as the ongoing impact they face as adults. We hope you'll join us.
Thank you for joining us for today's episode of Podclassed. To be notified when future episodes are available, subscribe to Podclassed on iTunes. To submit discussion topics or to recommend a student, parent, educator, or expert to be interviewed on future episodes, please send an email to podcast@readinghorizons.com. Podclass is brought to you by Reading Horizons, the creator of a data-driven literacy program for beginning readers, struggling readers, and English language learners of all ages. with data-informing software and teacher-led instruction, students receive targeted intervention that leads to rapid reading improvement. Visit readinghorizons.com/demo to see how Reading Horizons can transform your reading instruction. Reading Horizons. Reading is for everyone.